Hi everyone, Professor King here with my little maleficent bun going on. Hope you're all having a wonderful day. In this video, I'm going to discuss Cicero's excerpt from De Oratore, which talks about the structure of argument. Then we'll be looking eventually at chapter 7, which also talks about structures of argument, different, more contemporary structures of argument. But Cicero's is kind of the traditional thousands of years old kind of model that we form the basis of a lot of our argument on. So it's good to know it. So I'll just jump right to the share screen so that we can talk Cicero. It's a very short PowerPoint, so that's exciting. But again, if I go too fast and you need to pause as you are exposed to this, please make sure to do so. And again, if any questions come up, you can ask those. So since Cicero is another one of these guys that's written in an, thousands-year-old antiquated language that's translated into contemporary English, I figure it's probably going to be helpful if I help you to unpack some of these things in this video. So Cicero says that there are 5, but really 3 main parts of classical argument. And if we think about that, and if we look at what we see in front of the in our screen here, guess what we realize? Oh, if there's really 3 main parts of classical argument, that corresponds to introduction, body, and conclusion, right? He says that there's 5, but 2 of those 5 can be segmented into the other categories, and I'll show you where that happens. So Cicero begins by talking about the exordium, which would be the rough equivalent in writing to the introduction. If you recall back to Quintilian, remember Quintilian says a good orator is a person speaking and writing well for the public good, that last part in parentheses, because actually the Jesuits added that on. Then at the end of Quintilian, right, he talks about how writing is the same, right? Like now that we're shifting to a more literate culture in his time and, throughout the last several thousand years, because our culture is becoming increasingly more literate, means our culture is also capable of writing. And if we're capable of writing, aka documentation, instead of speaking, then we can see how the same rules of speech or spoken argument, rhetoric, apply to writing, okay? So Cicero is now taking that, right, and applying it. And now we are going to utilize that as writers in the structuring of our argument, okay? So Cicero lays this all out, and he says the first part is that introduction, right? And in our introductions in writing, we have the thesis statement, right? Maybe in Quintilian's time, they would have called it the case, right, where you set up your case. Or in law, they say like your opening arguments or whatever. But in our case, as writers in the academic milieu, right, in the academic atmosphere, it's the introduction that contains the thesis statement. So that's the exordium. Then we have narration. And don't think of this in terms of the general definition of narration that you've probably heard, right? For Cicero, narration is talking about the body paragraphs, the bulk of what is said. And within narration, there are 3 other parts. I meant to say not 2, but 3 are segmented into narration, right? So that's where the 5 come in, right? Because exordium, partition, confirmation, refutation, peroration are the 5, but really those 3 in the middle just make up the narration, right? So again, if we think about it in terms of what the contemporary college essay looks like, intro, body, conclusion, right? We have all of the parallels, all of the similar aspects that, again, we've been doing in this tradition of rhetoric and argument for thousands of years. It's crazy. You get to college and you think like, this is a stupid format. Like, where did this come from? Well, it's actually been around since, before our great grandparents were around. So, we're just part of that tradition. So we have the exordium, introduction, thesis statement, then the narration, the body paragraphs. So we have what Cicero calls the partition, which is providing the background information, right? And in our essays, you just, You're just providing enough so that you and your reader are on the same page, right? Think of the partition as kind of like the evidence of the evidence portion of your body paragraphs, right? It's the stuff you need to know in order to get to the confirmation, which we can see as sort of like contemporary modern day claims. The arguments that support the thesis, the sub-arguments, right, that harken back to that overall case or that overall thesis statement. And then this is where 103 kind of expands beyond 100. We have counter-arguments, right? We have the refutation. So it's not enough, again, to just be a cheerleader and to argue your side, to stack the deck. You have to acknowledge the other sides that exist in this issue, and you have to address them. But ultimately, your job in addressing them is to show why your argument, why your thesis is the superior one. So the problem with a lot of people when they get to the refutation, when they get to counter-arguments, they just say, and here's what other people are saying. Here's the people that disagree with me. And they leave it there. And that's not a complete argument. Because if I'm trying to convince you of something and I'm saying, you know, Gia Tolentino's book is great, right? And I give you all these reasons why I think this is a great book, but then somebody on the other side of the room says that book sucks. If all I do is say, hey, that guy on the other side of the room says this book sucks. Anyway, this is a great book. It feels clunky, right? It doesn't fit. What I need to do is a step beyond that, which is, hey, Gia Tolentino's book is great. Here's all the reasons why. And that guy across the room who says that the book sucks, here's why actually he's either wrong or a little misguided, or why I understand what he's saying, but you know, he's not looking at these other parts. That's what you do when you are addressing counter arguments. You are refuting them. You're not just saying that they exist, you're showing why your argument is the superior one. And it's really, I noticed that, you know, maybe not with Gen Z Zoomers as much, but younger millennials have a real problem with arguing with people because everything's about like, you know, harmony and like getting along. But you don't have to argue in a toxic or negative way, right? You can say like, hey, I get why you might feel that way about Tolentino, but here's why, you know, it's still a great book. So keep that in mind, right? Again, argument is about stasis. It's about mutual understanding. It's about seeing other people's points of view and still finding a way to move forward. It's not about winning. It's not about name calling. It's not about ad hominem attacks, right? So keep all that in mind. You're still being respectful even when you annihilate somebody else's argument, right? All right, so then we come to the last part, which is the peroration. I know it kind of looks like perforation. It's peroration, which essentially just means the conclusion, right? In law, that's where you get like the closing arguments, right? But you're kind of concluding your overall argument and really driving the point home of your analysis, right? Why you've told us all these things and what kind of the end result is, right? So those are the five, but really three main parts of classical argument. So now the questions for you as you consider Cicero, right? One, make sure you can define and understand these aspects, but also be able to understand his opinions about them. What does he think is important? What does he think is unimportant? What does he think you should do in each of these sections? What does he think is not helpful to do, right? Get his opinion about why, you know, the argument needs to be structured in this way and what has precedence over other aspects, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's the question for you as you're reading and taking notes and kind of looking back at your notes for you to consider, right? Because like I said, I know he's less challenging than Quintilian, but he's still a little perhaps inaccessible to us. So that's why I helped kind of demystify the summary a little bit. But now your job, now that you can kind of see that more clearly, is to look for how he feels about each of these parts, right? What he has to say. So that, and I'll take it off share screen now, that is Cicero. And one final thing I want to say about Cicero, especially in the context of what we're talking about today, in terms of the arguments that are going on today. You know, I see people and they're they're so distraught and they're stressed out, you know, and they see all this, you know, change and upheaval in the world and some backlash and you know, all the kind of stuff that's going on. And we tend to think in terms of like, it's never been this bad, you know, the apocalypse is coming because it's never been this bad. And the truth of the matter is, if you do any research on these old rhetoricians, right, like guys like Cicero and Quintilian, they were living at times where, I mean, people were getting their heads cut off and put on a stake. And I'm talking about like major politicians, like guys who ran whole city states. You know, there's tons of war and tons of argument, tons of brutality. So this idea that we've kind of lost our sense of decorum, right, or lost some sort of civility that we once had is just ridiculous. Again, if we think of the world as existing in complexity, in gray area, we've always had not just the civility and the decorum, but the brutality and the brutishness and everything in between. You know, we've also had, you know, the mundane, the guy who's probably just like sitting off on the corner, like smoking a cigarette, like, oh, that's weird, right? So sometimes when we read these texts, we tend to glorify these writers, or we tend to sort of exalt them to a status of like, oh, these brilliant, you know, rhetorical strategists, these brilliant statesmen, these brilliant orators. They never muddied or dirtied their hands with any of this, you know, aggression or you know, confrontation or things like that. They did. That was par for the course during their time. So, you know, but also rhetoric was par for the course as well, right? It was living in a time of complexity, just as we're living in now. So when I talk about the tradition, right, and I talk about how we are part of this very long-standing, albeit Western tradition, right, of rhetoric, and that's what we're learning here, that does not mean that anything that's going on today is not also now part of that tradition. We can look at everything in our world through this lens of, you know, if this protest is a text, or if this mural on the side of a wall, this political mural is a text, or if this person speaking this in this viral video is a text, how do we analyze that rhetorically? And what do we do with that in order to, again, speak well for the public good, for the betterment of society? And that is what, again, like, it gives me chills when I think about it, because that is what's so incredibly powerful and important about what we do in this, you know, not in this room, right, but in these classrooms, right, in these academic contexts. It's not just a 16-week course that you know, throw away, or a 6-week course that you throw away and never think about again. The world is a text, and it's a text that we can constantly improve upon, and it's a text that we can change as much as we want, as long as we're willing to put in the work to do so, as long as we're willing to do so for the betterment of society, for that stasis and mutual understanding. So again, I know, you know, I know that's kind of me on my soapbox or whatever, but it brings guys like Cicero and Quintilian into the present day, and it brings everyone we're reading, from Baldwin to Angela Davis to Gia Tolentino and beyond. You know, it's, again, we're all in this eternal conversation, which is so cool. It's not ending. We can all be part of this. We can all be those intellectuals that strive to make the world better. And rhetoric is one major way that we do it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you have any questions, again, feel free to message me. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you all in cyberspace soon. Okay, bye-bye.